Good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of directors for the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And we welcome you to tonight's virtual outing. The Grand Canyon Historical Society, our mission is to celebrate and promote the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And just last year in 2024, we celebrated 40 years of existence when the society was started by some pioneer members of Grand Canyon Village. We encourage you to become a member. Our dues are only $35 a year. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we're hopeful that many of you can join us so that we can continue to expand all of our activities like these virtual outings and in-person outings and our tri-annual history symposiums. If you do become a member, you'll get 4 issues in the calendar year of the Old Pioneer magazine, which has a lot of history articles about the Grand Canyon and the Grand Canyon region. So we do these virtual outings. We conduct tours at the South and North Rim, and you can find it on our website. Our website is very easy, grandcanyonhistory.org.
Cindy lives in Page and worked for the National Park Service for 10 years as a seasonal interpretive ranger at Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. And she volunteered in the off-season for cultural resources. In a previous life, Cindy completed her master's degree in communicative disorders at the University of New Mexico and worked 15 years in that field in New Mexico, Utah, Washington, and Arizona.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. This is a modification of a talk I gave in October for that Colorado River Basin History Symposium, but there we were limited to having talks that were under 20 minutes. So I've added quite a few historic slides, and I think it fleshes out the area quite a bit better. So I promise not to keep you too late. If you're on the East Coast, I know you got to tune out whenever you need to, but Dick Sprang worked as a newspaper artist, a Western pulp fiction writer, and he was one of the very first Batman cartoonists. When he moved to Sedona, after moving there, he and his friends and companions would spend weeks at a time on the Colorado River in Glen Canyon and recorded a lot of their explorations there. Maybe like you, if you've fallen in love with canyon country, it can become more than a passion. It might become an obsession. And this is how he felt about it. He said, "The big river always takes its toll, they say. It's extracted one from me. It's captured darn near every waking moment. I dream about it. Bad enough before. Now I'm hopelessly lost. That damned country is worse than any woman or any bottle in the hold it takes on a man."
Wow.
So as Tom said, I do some volunteering for Glen Canyon National Recreation Area and Cultural Resources. And I was able to help them with their annual museum inventory. And I had to pull this folder, 17517, folder 10, and I saw it was Dick Sprang's Oral History of Hite, and I was just blown away. And I wanted to read through it right away really fast. I wanted to know more about Hite. It's an area that's upstream from us quite a ways, at the other end of Lake Powell. And I wanted to know more about Dick. I had heard of him and his canyon explorations. I'd read some books where he was mentioned. So I felt like gold had fallen in my lap. Oh, and I should have mentioned that he recorded this in 1984. Let's go back. I want to tell you one more thing. He sat at his table in his home in Prescott at the time, 1984. He spoke into a reel-to-reel tape recorder. It was later transcribed. He was not interviewed, but I think he had a list of questions. He's an extremely organized guy, as you'll see from the kind of documentation he kept. Dick was born in Fremont, Ohio, and he worked in Toledo before moving to New York City. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with the area, Where the red star is where the Hite Ferry area is located. And that's southeastern Utah on the Colorado River. Where I'm located, Page, Arizona, is just to the south of this map in northern Arizona. And Grand Canyon is below us. While Dick was living in New York City, he haunted bookstores and collected Western memorabilia, including copies of these plan and profile maps of the Colorado River in Glen Canyon. The survey for these maps was completed or done in 1921, and the maps were published in 1922. So you'll often see either date in reference to these plan and profile maps. But if you're like me, when you first look at a map like this, it looks like spider webs. After you stare at it for a while, if you're real familiar with the canyons, it'll start making more sense. But at the north end of the top of the map, where the blue arrow is, that's North Wash coming in just off this section of the map. And that was one of the later entrances. That's where Dick, decades later, came into Glen Canyon. But where the Trachyte Creek is, that's the ferry crossing where the blue star is. It was a wagon road back in, from the 1880s, 90s, probably until whenever the road was improved down North Wash and automobiles could get in there. And you can respond to this in chat if you want, if you know, or if you want to guess why the survey team in 1921 was only plotting the map and surveying to the 3,900 foot level. And down at the bottom, Klein Library Special Collections is where Dick's archives are, and these maps have been digitized. You can look at his collection online there. That's been digitized. And even if you enlarge it, you might be able to read some of those penciled notations that he or his wife, Judy Thomas, put on these maps. And of interest to the Grand Canyon people, the Cole brothers were on that 1921 survey. And in the top photo, they're trying to get a boat off the rocks. That was probably a common occurrence. And there's a photo of them at the bottom. So with Dick as our guide, let's journey back to Glen Canyon before the dam. He first went down North Wash in October of 1950 with a couple friends. He said that the sign warned of 60 wash crossings in 18 miles, and that if the sign didn't give the traveler pause, the wash crossings did. That you had to really gear down, plow through deep sand, drive slow, grind up steep slopes, and inexperienced drivers would often drown the ignition by driving too fast through those water crossings. Flash floods, of course, required a different technique. If you were caught at a flash flood in a crossing, you either had to retreat to Hanksville, Utah, if you even could, or just wait it out. And you better have some supplies with you if you're going to wait it out. North Wash entered the Colorado River on the west bank, or the right-hand side. The miners who worked that area called it Crescent Bar, so sometimes you'll see it on old maps as Crescent Wash. And then the road continued south to Hite Ferry area. If the river was in high flow, that road could be flooded. So at the north end, or the top end of this, is also North Wash, more than 167 miles, river miles upstream from Lee's Ferry. On the map, you probably can't see it's listed as Highway 95. It goes south for 5 miles to the lower arrow, which is the Dandy Crossing, or the Hite area, the Hite Crossing, or sometimes called the Chafin Ferry. And again, at the mouth of Trachyte Creek. That North Wash area is across from the modern Hite Marina, which hasn't been used as a marina in many, many years. The reservoir has retreated far below this area. And then after the crossing on the ferry, you continue north. The White Canyon area is where that mill was located. And that's actually Farley Canyon that comes in right there. That's where the road goes. And then jogged around White Canyon to the lower right before the bridge went in. That 1952 U.S. Geological Survey map is actually a little more useful now than maps that show the reservoir. And Texaco road map of the 1950s had in southeastern Utah that you shouldn't travel in this area without a guide. So it was at Hite that Dick Sprang first met Arthur Chafin. He was known as Arth to his friends. That's A-R-T-H, not Art, although you see it both ways in print. And Arth was reluctant to share firsthand, hard-earned river knowledge with this group he didn't know anything about. So Dick diagnosed canyonitis, and he understood this condition a lot better after he gained canyon and river information and experience in a couple more years. But Dick described Arth as tough and hardworking, small of stature, and with a gentle voice. And he knew the river better than anyone, with very few exceptions. Dick had a lot of admiration for him, and they soon became trusted friends. One reason that Arth knew the river better than very few other people is because he'd been on the river since the age of 12. He helped his father and his older brothers with their mining claims along the river. And they were at Hanson Creek area, which is 33 miles below Hite. And there was a horse trail from the Henry Mountains down Hanson Creek. So that's how a lot of the miners got access to that part of Glen Canyon. It says that his father was making some money. He could employ 10 men for 2 years there. But that part of the difficulty was that they had to transport the ore 200 miles overland to the railroad. Whoops. And then down at the bottom left on that article, it talks about how there's 75 men panning gold in the 50 miles along the river there, and that there's a lot of difficulty in getting the dirt up to the water, but they said that there's a dry washing process they're trying right now. And in a few more years, when Arth was a little older, he worked as a watchman at the Stanton's Dredge, which was not too far away. And he also ran a trading post there and traded with Navajos who would come across the river. And he walked as a mail carrier many miles upstream, probably to about the Tickaboo area, where the mail from the Hite post office was brought partway down the canyon. And then he'd carry the mail the rest of the way to the miners that were working along his section of the river. And then he also worked a lot of mining claims throughout his life. He and his wife Della lived at the ranch at Hite, and they grew a bountiful orchard. They gave away a lot of fruit to both locals and travelers. It was a little bit semi-tropical. They grew figs and pomegranates, grapes, melons, peaches. Some local oral histories talk about their families going there and camping for a week and canning peaches, for example. But it's considered one of the more isolated ranches or locations in the continental US. The railroad was 120 miles away, and their closest neighbor was way downstream at Hite Ferry. The ranch was located at that big bend in the river where the crossing was, and it was something of an oasis, lots of trees there. It was self-sufficient. They had livestock and chickens, and they grew the feed for the livestock as well as vegetables and their own food. And people got across the river any way they could. Harry Ailson said that in low water, you could drive a wagon across, but generally it wasn't considered a ford. It was considered a crossing, and the river would often be high, but livestock swam across. And pay attention to this feature on the skyline. This is what it looked like last fall. And I'll show you a side-by-side picture. So the blue arrow on the left, that cliff line has been submerged under sediment that's come down and filled up that top end of the reservoir. I think Some people have suggested there's maybe 120 feet of sediment there. Dick considered Arth a riverbank engineer. They were miles away from anywhere, and he had a lot of tools and probably some welding equipment, and he cobbled together and made things work in this very remote location. Here he used an old car engine to power the paddle wheel for the boat. And the ferry went through a lot of different iterations. There's a little bit different. For many, many, many years, Arth lobbied private groups and the state of Utah for money to improve the road. He even borrowed a bulldozer from the county and tried to make North Wash passable to automobiles. But, you know, we're talking about the Depression in the 30s, followed by World War II. So they were in this isolated part of the state of Utah, and it was really cut off from the rest of the state. But finally, September 17th, 1946, they dedicated the Hite Ferry. 400 people were in attendance, including the governor of Utah and E.P. Pechtel, who is considered the father of Capitol Reef, then a national monument. And Pechtel also coined the term Wayne Wonderland, which is still in use today to promote the scenery of Wayne County. What else do I want to tell you about the dedication? Can't remember. Harry Elson is here on the right with Arth on the left in this photo. They're sharing a laugh. Harry was a river guide and an adventurer, and he wrote the dedication in that Hite Ferry booklet. Oh, he helped carry the cable down from Geneva Steel in Provo all the way to Hite. And Dick Sprang thought that Harry probably helped with some of the ferry construction as well. And the San Juan band was ferried across, the high school band, to play. Here they are. The governor's car was the first car taken across the river, and a couple hundred people were waiting on the San Juan County side to ride back over and join the festivities. And in kind of a fine Utah tradition, on the way back, they held a symbolic marriage ceremony to unite three counties, Wayne, Garfield, and San Juan County. Pretty happy that they had this official recognition and could travel more easily. But Arth and Della had some tent cabins, and they provided other camping accommodations, and meals could be taken with the caretakers. Arth wanted to provide short, just day trip boat rides on the river, motorboats, and also horse rides and pack trips, longer pack trips. And he highlighted scenic attractions along the road for automobile travelers. I'm not sure how official any of these tourist activities became. Maybe some of the gals who lived there can talk to that. Pechtel considered Capitol Reef the drawing card for the road, and it was connecting these two national monuments, Capitol Reef and Natural Bridges, with the crossing at Hite Ferry. Maybe it's too small to see where the new road section is drawn in, but Desert Magazine promoted the new road in February of 1947, and they advised travelers what they could expect. It's kind of a nice article. E.P. Pechtel said, "When the road is oiled, you will need a 6-lane highway on 91 to handle all the traffic coming to use this." And 91 is over there on the left. That's I-15. I think I-15, parts of it have a lot more than 6 lanes now, and it's probably not because of the road through Hite, but gets a lot more traffic than it ever used to. The Desert Magazine also advised that you take an extra car. 2 cars travel together in case of a breakdown, and you should not count on getting gas at Hite. Oh yeah, in 1933, just an aside, Pechtel was a state legislator in Utah. Every state legislator supported the proposal for Capitol Reef National Monument. And if we go back about 60 years earlier than this time, we can find Cass Hite showing up there. And he founded the small settlement that was named for him. Eventually, his brothers joined him and opened a store and a post office there, and he kicked off the gold mining boom in the area first known as White Canyon. Greg Crampton, the historian of Glen Canyon for many years, said that Hite was a strong believer in the rule that it's easier to mine gold out of an investor's pocket than it is out of the ground. And his Navajo name is handwritten on this historic photo. It's Hosteen Pishlakai, which loosely translates Mr. Silver. And the photo is of his ranch that he built downstream at Tickaboo, about 15 miles from Hite and a mile up the canyon. And he died at his ranch when he was about 60. He led a very colorful life. There's lots of articles and books written about him. In the upper left photo, that's historian Charles Kelly standing at the remains of the chimney of a Hite cabin. And there's 2 graves there. We'll talk about the other one in a minute. 2 other miners are buried under the waters of Lake Powell. And by the way, the river runners and Dick and his friends would go visit these graves. And Dick even tended the grave, Cass Hite's grave, and, just fixed the boards a little bit around it. But Alonzo Turner ran the river in a hand-built skiff from Green River down through Cataract Canyon in 1907. And he claimed he ran all the rapids. But of course, nobody else could verify that. But he was a miner, and he mined in the Henry Mountains in the summertime and in Glen Canyon at California Bar in, did I say that right? Summer? Yeah, in the winter, he was down in the canyon where it was more comfortable temperature. Let's see. And he built this 2-room cobblestone cabin. And again, even after it fell to ruins, a lot of the people going through Glen Canyon would stop there and there goes my, sorry, dropped the mouse. Okay, we're back on lawn. He was buried in a prospect hole that he dug himself, his friends found out later. And 10 years earlier, Alonzo had discovered Cass Hite's body and helped bury Cass. So Arth Chafin was a friend of Lon Turner's, and he transported the materials downstream to build this crude but touching headstone, complete with misspellings, even of Turner's last name. And at KP is Knights of Pythias, and that should be Lodge. But, I think about Arth was on the river at age 12. He probably didn't really have much schooling. And John Dalen died prospecting 15 miles below Hite. 2 of his sons buried him in a grave next to Cass Hite's. His death certificate listed unknown but natural as cause of death. And he had been born to Swedish Latter-day Saint immigrants to Salt Lake City, Utah. And later he and his wife and children homesteaded in a community named for him, Dalen, Idaho. It's east of Idaho Falls. But in 1934, that's the Great Depression, maybe the lure of Glen Canyon gold drew he and his sons south. Don't really know much about him. It was on that October 1950 trip that Dick and his wife, Duty Thomas, met Pearl Baker. She was living in a tent cabin at Hite, and she wrote her recollections, her memoirs, and she was a bit of a local history expert. She was working on this book, Trail on the Water, at the time, and it's about Bert Loper, who had died the year before on a river trip in Marble Canyon. And Pearl grew up on a ranch near Hanksville, Utah, and she ran it when she was widowed as a young woman with her 2 small sons. And she met Dick and his group. They were camped outside her house, her tent house, and probably were having a pretty good time that evening. She introduced herself by sticking her head out and saying, "You're all having so goddamn much fun. I'd like to join you." and she visited the Sprang Ranch near Teasdale often in the 1960s. Here she is a few years later than that other picture, back at the cabin. I think she was, this might have been about 1960. Oh yeah, it says 1960. But Pearl worked at the one-room schoolhouse across the river at White Canyon during the uranium boom. A processing mill opened there for a few years. And she would take the ferry back and forth. There were 30 students. One of the, I don't know if Larry Lopp is still with us, but she attended school there for 6 months and Pearl was her teacher. So she might have to leave early, but we could ask her some questions about that. The mill closed, a new company built it, or I'm sorry, bought it, and they opened the next mill at Mexican Hat. So that new company is the one that put in the Moki Dugway. And just to show you some luxurious camping setups that the Sprangs had, they would like to set up for several days at a time. And they brought their pets with them. The dog is in the center, his name is Pard, and over on the right, basking in a chair in the sun, is Mickey, the cat. We'll talk a lot about him in a minute. But really nice setup. And Duty Thomas did the cooking. They had a lot of canned goods they brought with them, and baked goods. She had a Dutch oven and turned out some pretty delicious sounding meals. They also had a couple of friends with planes. So occasionally they would get airdrops to resupply. One of their pilot friends from Sedona mentioned trying to come up and find where they were camped after they'd been on the river for about a month. And so he carefully searched upstream throughout Glen Canyon, and he started getting more and more worried. The further he got, he thought they should be down to this location by now. And they were still at Hanson Creek. So they'd been on the river almost a month and they'd only made it 33 miles. That 1950 trip had the good fortune of Duty and Dick meeting Harry Ailson at the mouth of the Escalante River. They ended up camping together for 2 nights and they started plotting future trips, both by land and water. And Duty's holding Mickey there, and Pard is next to Harry. They generally took time off in the fall. That's when Harry's guide business had ended, and Dick could make time in his Batman schedule. Harry wrote in his journal, "Every night, Mickey goes to bed with Duty, his head beside hers, sticking out of her sleeping bag, one paw on her hair, breathing in her ear. Lucky bastard." And there Mickey is on the boat, fearless. Dogs will go anywhere, but the cat is really impressive to me. Dick wrote to Stan Jones much later that Mickey was built like a buffalo with the heart of a lion. He would stride through water like a tiger. He was fearless, and he liked sleeping in Anasazi ruins. Harry was a bit of a character as well. He is described as putting on clothing in the morning because it was so cold. He just put clothing over his pajamas. And then when the day would warm up, he'd peel off the layers. So here he is in his pajamas rowing downstream. Dick wrote to Harry that he tried to make his schedule, arrange it so that he could support his trips and his explorations, and that Duty was the perfect partner. But he still had to make a lot of sacrifices and not do all the trips that he would like to do. Harry tried to get him to do some trips in Grand Canyon, and I think he didn't want to spread himself that far, maybe, and he knew that Glen Canyon would take more than a lifetime to see, and there were probably already inklings of the coming dam. So there was a sense of urgency to really spend as much time in Glen Canyon as he could. But they started cooking up these ideas, especially Dick wanted to document things a little more formally and for the permanent filing of notes. And then he said this system would provide to those who follow us an orderly and complete record of our findings. And he actually had some forms printed up and notebooks, and he was a really organized person. He did a couple press releases, and they called, even though it was only 3 people, Dick, Duty, and Harry, they called themselves the Canyon Surveys. And he wrote to the newspaper that we're trying to pin down some knowledge of that little-known country north of Lee's Ferry. And here they are on one of their trips, and they're poring over the maps, and they're trying to decide and plot out what kinds of explorations they're going to be doing. This is some of the documentation that Dick drew, and on the left, there's a map with the Colorado River and the canyons ticked off in mile increments, and starting at Lee's Ferry at the south end and going up to North Wash. On the right, he had drawn this sketch and then typed in these detailed notes when he got home. And the writing there says, "I should have swung more to face Whale Rock." I think if we have some river runners present, they can relate to that. But he went through this chute backwards. And of interest is that the river flow was only 1,500 cubic feet per second. So it brought out a lot of rocks at this rapid. And the canyon with the blue star they named it Forgotten Canyon. It was an unnamed canyon. But Dick had been looking at these aerial photographs from the Soil Conservation Service, and he could see that that canyon was huge, and it ran for maybe 9 miles. But as he wrote later to Stan Jones, that the contours on that 1921 survey closed off that canyon at the 3,900 foot level. So they eliminated 90% of the length. So that's one of the reasons they called it Forgotten. And this is a view a little closer to the river, and you can see how complicated the canyons are there. Maybe that 1921 group was getting a little tired by that point too. It took some effort to get into that canyon. They reconnoitered 2 different times, and it wasn't until the 3rd time that they were actually successful. If you've been in slot canyons filled with water in October, you know how fast hypothermia can set in. And the first time they went in, they turned around. But they went back with the right kinds of ropes and tools, and they enlarged the Moki steps that were 50 feet above the slot. And they put up a safety line, and they even, with assists, got Pard and Mickey up. And this is further up canyon is where they found what Dick called 3 Warrior Ruin. We know it today as Defiance House. Harry's standing there on the left, and Duty's on the right. And you can see those pictographs. The 3 warriors are high up on the canyon wall. Duty is standing in that photo on the right. She's holding a stick that's longer than herself and showing how high on the wall the warriors are. Dick described this sense of reverence and this absolute stillness. It was unlike the other pot-hunted sites of the area, that they felt like they were the first people to be there since the original inhabitants, maybe 7 or 8 centuries before. Very sadly, Duty passed away in early 1958 after a short illness, and she requested that her ashes be scattered in this location. Harry wrote a letter of condolence to Dick and said, "We can be happy that we had these up to months that we enjoyed in the canyon, and I'm glad to know where she wished her ashes to go and that he would pay respects when he was in that location." Near this granary, there's an inscription. It says, "Duty and her cat Mickey, 11/7/53." Glen Canyon was known to be a pretty easy float trip, and a lot of Boy Scouts had done it. But it did claim some lives, including Reed Maxfield, who was the ferryman in April of 1957. He had taken his wife across the river on the ferry boat so that she could go pick up the mail at White Canyon. And when she came back, the boat was there, but Reed was gone. And they looked and looked for his body, and I think they found it about a week later at the Glen Canyon dam site. Dick married fellow artist and widow Elizabeth Lewis. She lived on a ranch at Fruta in Capitol Reef. And they took 2 6-week river trips. The first was in 1959. And she published many years later her journal, her sketches, and her journal that she kept on that trip, and she called it Goodbye River. I think this book is still available. I bought a used copy. Of course, in 1959, Glen Canyon Dam project was going, and the takeout was 40 miles upstream from Lee's Ferry at Cane Creek. So the writing was on the wall. The canyon was going away. Dick described Hite as being deteriorated and like a junkyard. And he said that irresponsible guides and river runners had set shorelines on fire, and that it was disgusting but fitting tribute, like a terminal illness followed by cremation. Dick and Elizabeth got very involved in protection efforts for Rainbow Bridge National Monument to protect it from the flooding that was coming. He wrote to Harry James, who was the executive of the Desert Protective Council, "I'm convinced that the least impairment of the bridge area would result by not constructing upstream diversion works or a downstream restraining dam." It's really interesting to think about what kinds of efforts people would have gone to protect Rainbow Bridge, which really would have just destroyed the area. Instead of letting the waters from the lake, go under it at some points. I think they may have made Glen Canyon Dam a little shorter so that it wouldn't totally flow over Rainbow Bridge. But if you haven't read Rainbow Bridge Administrative History, it's available on the nps.gov Rainbow Bridge website, and it's very interesting. Dick's idea was to create Rainbow Bridge National Park. The idea really didn't go too far, but here he's writing to Harry James, the Desert Protective Council guy, and Agnes Woodbury, who's at the University of Utah. They were kind of in agreement. They were in communication with Stuart Udall, who was then the Secretary of Interior. Dick proposes that the boundary for this new national park be at the 6,400-foot level and extend to the west of Navajo Mountain. I don't think that idea went very far, but maybe Harvey Leak knows more about this history or the administrative history. But now just a few photos about the later years. This is 1962, a trip across the river. I like how the little sign below the call for ferry operators says, "No boats docked on ramps." And every time I look at this photo, I think, would you put your car on this? Or would you ride on this? Maybe depending on the water level, right? I guess there are cables, but it doesn't really look like the most stable or seaworthy of crafts. And this, I think, is Woody Edgell. He was the last ferry operator, and he ran a store in Farley Canyon. This is that blue station wagon. You can see the vegetation along the river. Here's some willows. By 1966, the 3 bridges spanning the canyons to the north were completed and put the ferry out of business. The reservoir was filling. In his later years, Dick attended many comic conventions, and he got some well-deserved recognition for his cartooning and was able to release some lithographs. He reminds us that you have to get your muscles into the rock, that you have to lounge in the shade of the greenery and be down there alone many weeks to realize the beauty of that country. Fortunately, a place like this you can still get to. And Dick reminds us of the hub that Hite represented as entrance into Glen Canyon and the community it served, the miners, the river runners, the locals, the travelers. They were looking for the resources the canyon had to offer, like the minerals or archaeology or the scenery or the recreation, the exploration, the relaxation. And he reminds us also of some of the buried history under the lake. And with the reservoir retreating, maybe some of that history will even reemerge. This is not quite the same location. It's at the Overlook. This is the takeout for the Cataract Canyon rafting trips looking towards the Dirty Devil area. I think next year, that's so steep, that takeout, it's really hard to get boats out of there. Tom can talk about getting a boat in there, but I think next year they're going to move it to the east side of the canyon over by the Hite Marina side. And sometimes I like to give myself a geologic reality check and remind myself that Glen Canyon Dam is temporary in geologic time, and that way before our time, back in the Pleistocene up to 1.8 million years ago, in the Western Grand Canyon, there really was lava dams, and they were intermittently blocking the canyon and pounding the water, some say all the way up to Moab. So the area has been inundated before, way before our time. But for us in our lifetime, we have to content ourselves with the memories and the photographs of the people who are lucky enough to see Glen Canyon in person. And here's a picture of some of that lava flow in the Western Grand Canyon. Dick recommended Louis Freeman's book for more about Glen Canyon history. Although it's called Down the Grand Canyon, in 1922, Freeman was part of that crew that took these old Edison boats that had been used before and were really dried out. Here he's soaking it, trying to take care of some of the leaks. They took those boats upstream from Lee's Ferry to Hull's Crossing, and they picked up the politicians, the religious leaders, the USGS engineers, and they brought them down through that stretch of the canyon. They showed them some dam sites. That group was on their way to Santa Fe, to the meeting with Herbert Hoover that divided the Colorado Basin into the upper and lower sections and started the allocation process that we're still living with and dealing with today. So this book is available to read free on Google Books online, or you can download it. And we mentioned Greg Crampton. He worked for many summers recording the history under the lake, and his book Ghosts of Glen Canyon is a good summary of that. And then Dick did not mention Gary Topping's book, but the book is dedicated to him. It wasn't published for another 10 years after the oral history interview. And the photos on the front and back cover are by Gus Scott. Our Glen Canyon Conservancy at this website has recently posted the logbooks of Stan Jones. There's 2 of them that have been digitized. And he and Dick corresponded quite a bit, and even went out and looked around to find what roads were still available. And Stan was responsible for putting out this map, and I think it's still published. I'm not sure if it's published every year, but that's worth looking at if you like canyon history. And then a few more, Arthur Chafin's, these oral histories have been digitized, they're online. Arthur Chafin's is conducted by P.T. Riley. Pearl Baker talks about her teaching and the White Canyon uranium boom. Gus Scott has an oral history interview on this organization's website, Grand Canyon Historical Society. And then the collections, some of them have been digitized, a lot actually, and Dick Sprangs is at Northern Arizona University Klein Library Special Collections. Harry Ailson's is at the Utah State Historical Society. And Gus is on the right. He took a trip in 1955 with his college roommate, Bob. They recorded some scientific observations in the canyon. They climbed to Navajo Mountain. And I think Gus he can tell us, he had 3 or 4 other trips in Glen Canyon. So he's quite a resource for what was happening. His journal, Glen Canyon, The Living Heart, is on that riverguides.org website. It's been transcribed. And I think this is the boat they took. And I think this boat is in the Powell Museum collection here in Page. And if you have any questions, you can ask us, right?
That's
okay.
Very nice.
Should I stop the share?
Yeah. That's great, Cindy. I've got some questions for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Duddy Thomas?
Duty.
Duty, thank you.
I think it was Gertrude and then Duty, D-U-D-Y.
Okay. what's the earliest you know about her? Meaning, where was she from? How did she kind
I
of
think
fall
she
in
was
love with
from,
that country?
I don't know. Gus would know more about that, but she and her first husband had taken guide trips in Monument Valley much earlier. But somehow Dick and she met in Sedona, I think.
Okay. And she always just seems like a mysterious figure. She's clearly a part of that country.
Hmm.
I,
She's definitely a part of that country.
I'd sure like to know more about her. The
Well, ask Gus.
Yes, I have. And he's well, we're working on that.
Yeah.
Really fascinating. Just wanting to know more about her. Do you know um, if the bodies of Cass Hite and Alonzo Turner and John Dellum, were those bodies removed before the reservoir came up? They're still
No.
there.
In fact, there's an old map of the reservoir of Lake Powell that has a buoy that says Cass Heights grave.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh. Okay. Gosh. Um, you asked a question at the start of this talk, which is, why did it say 3,900?
Right.
I've got it. An answer. I wonder if anybody else has an answer. Anybody else want to answer that question that Cindy threw in? Well, not hearing that. You can unmute yourselves. I think y'all can unmute yourselves. Maybe you can't. Susan, can you
Well,
unmute
Susan
everybody?
can unmute.
Is that because that was going to be the height of Glen Canyon Dam, and then they dropped it to 37?
It had to do with dams. They didn't intend to go to 3,900 feet, but they knew that they just needed to survey to 3,900 feet. That would cover it.
Nice. Do you have a
But it's
sense?
amazing, just an aside, it's amazing how early the dam talk was, and before then too. So we always think it got ramped up in the 50s or something, but no, there were talks of dams in Grand Canyon, Ralph Cameron, 1912. As soon as electricity became a big deal, hydroelectric was all the rage.
Cindy, I'm wondering, do you have a sense of how many families were at Hite during the peak of its?
100, how many residents at White Canyon?
Yeah.
I think there were 100 or 125. There were 30 students.
Okay. So
Pearl's, can I tell one of Pearl's stories?
yeah,
She
please.
said that her rule was kids had to wear shoes to school, and that this one family's kid showed up without shoes on, and she sent him home, and the dad moved. Took him out of school and moved. My kid doesn't have to wear shoes if he doesn't want to.
Huh. Um, uh, uh, Chad Niehaus has asked a question. Did Dick and Harry and Duty, did they make any maps like the Bernheimer Rainbow Bridge expedition did?
Gary Topping has an article and he talks about how the canyon surveys maybe sort of petered out, that they actually got more into the relaxation than the documentation. And I think once Duty died, things maybe fell apart a little bit. But Dick has some maps that he has drawn. They're in his collection. You can look at them at Klein Library.
Okay.
But I don't know that they never published. That's what Gary dinged them for. He said they never published their stuff. They recorded it. And maybe they were reluctant. And that's what Dick said in one of his letters. It's like, we're not just going to give this to anybody. It's kind of like you want to know that people are going to be respectful of the archaeology you found and stuff like that. Although, in the 50s, they were burying their dog food cans and stuff. And I know that the salvage archaeology team found this dog food can, and they thought they were the first archaeologists there, so they were wondering what's going on with this.
That's interesting. Can you speak a little bit to this? I've been really torn by this. Going through the Gene Foster material at the Museum of Northern Arizona, and also through the Otis Marston collection, the letters there. Gene writes about this thing, about people doing, I wouldn't call it salvage archaeology, I would call it pot hunting, plain and simple, and how they wouldn't share their information with anybody. Gene worked, really hard to get information from others, and she really struggled with that issue. Can you speak to that a little bit? No.
Not really. I mean, yeah.
It's tough because you could call it pot hunting. Gene wrote that one of the commercial companies gave their clients shovels and said, just dig whatever you see, dig, because it's all going to be under the reservoir. It's all, if we don't get it now, it's going to be gone. So I can appreciate that logic. And yet,
yeah, I know.
Without knowing where and what, it really had no archaeological significance to place. So it's really
it's a big topic.
okay.
It's all I can say, and that's why I liked this, because I could just stick to the springboard of his 50-page document and not go too far. Although I brought in the mining history, and he had gone to those graves and things like that.
Yeah.
Dick didn't even talk about the ferry dedication because he said I wasn't there. But, Harry was a big part of that, 1946.
Big part, yeah.
And it's important history for Hite.
Yes. Mark B., you had a good question here. Do you want to unmute yourself and bring that question in? Or do we need to ask you?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Okay, when I was there a couple of years ago, I've been there a couple of times. The site seemed to be pretty much not quite abandoned, but pretty desolate. And I just was wondering, I've read that the government has several times offered concessions out there, and I don't know that anybody's taken them up on them. But is there any future for that area? Not just necessarily in development, but just anything in that regard?
It looks pretty bad. In September when we were there, I had heard, that Glen Canyon put out for a concessionaire for the Hite outpost, and it was going to be used as an outdoor recreation hub. And the campgrounds are still there. They look pretty shabby, and the outpost is like, not as cute as I was hoping it would be. The ranger station was closed. And I think though next summer, and I don't know what the plans are right now, but that they're going to have that Cataract Canyon takeout on the Hite side. It looks like you can still stay at the campground.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if people do. It's too hot in the summer without being able to go jump in the lake.
Well, that brought up my second question, whether they're going to remove that large runway worth of concrete, or are they going to expand it so that river runners can use it?
I don't know. I guess if they put in an access for Cataract Canyon, it'll probably be to the north, and they'll go down that concrete launch and then cut to the north somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's very problematic there because it's difficult to build infrastructure over the reservoir sediment without there being some sort of underpinning of a ridge or native land there. So putting a new ramp in there is not just a matter of extending the concrete, because you have to stay down on real tierra firma, which is a big excavation of a reservoir sediment. So, and again, we're just keeping in mind that we're talking about the concrete ramp at the new Hite, not the historic Hite where the ferry was, over at 10 miles downstream. I think it's about
5 miles.
Is it 5 miles? Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Not that far, not 10. Thank you. And then Peter
Might
Corbin.
seem like it.
One last thing is I'd like to, I don't know if this is available, but when in-person meetings are back available, I don't know whether the society would consider maybe sponsoring a weekend camping trip there.
That'd be
Just to
fun.
explore the locale and the
Yeah.
sites that Cindy has mentioned. Thank you.
That's a
It's
great
good
idea.
hiking.
Peter Corbett, you had an interesting observation. Do you want to bring that in about Duty, sorry?
Yeah.
Duty.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I did. Just within the past week, I saw a reference to Duty Thomas. And she lived on the Doodlebug Ranch on Oak Creek, where Poco Diablo Resort is now. And of course, the name stood out to me. And apparently, she may have lived in a small rock house right on the creek. And I don't know if it's still there. I'd be really curious. I'd stayed at the resort last week, and I didn't get to explore down there. But she sounds like a very interesting character. And there was a reference to her husband too, maybe Mr. Thomas. I don't know.
Yeah. Doodlebug is where Orson Welles had a ranch.
Wow.
I will have to ask my friend who told me about that. But see, I don't know how you would figure out. I guess that got flooded too, and they had to move. They were renting it, I think. Orson Welles was. His daughter lives in Sedona and wrote an article that's published about where they lived. So, Peter, will you look up Orson Welles' daughter and that article about Sedona? Maybe you can figure out if it's the same location.
Yeah, I like to do that. What do you know the daughter's name, first name?
No, but it'd be easy to find because I just did some Googling and this article by her came up. She lives in Sedona.
Okay.
And she talked about her memories there and where they were. And this friend had told me that I'll ask Lisa again about the Doodlebug because she said the house had wider doors for Orson, but it seemed like they were renting. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe they rented a house with wide doors.
I'll look into it.
Yeah.
Great stuff on Hite, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Thank Dick and thank Gus.
Yeah. Gus Scott is an amazing resource for
Is he here tonight?
all things Glen Canyon.
Well, I'm going to just try to. Hello,
Hey,
Hi.
Paul.
this is Paul. I've been trying to write it out, but I can't write it out on this laptop. A couple of things. Katie Lee, who is a folk singer that we knew that lived in Sedona, right near where we did, and she lived in Jerome, and she's done lots and lots of songs about going through the river, the good, the bad, and the evil. She was on television repeatedly trying to get the dam taken down. She called the Reclamation Bureau the Nation Bureau,
Right.
and she has albums of her songs of the river, and they're well listened. They're well worth listening to. The Orson Welles house is right above our house in Oak Creek. It's up in the canyon.
But his
And,
first place was Doodlebug.
well, he may have been a doodlebug. You know, that's where Marguerite Stouty was. She's the one who built the Chapel of the Holy Cross. But his house, he has a big house. He had a big house up in Oak Creek Canyon, Indian Gardens, and that's where I think his daughter still owns that house.
Right. His daughter explained this first place they lived and it was too close to the creek.
Yeah. Well,
But that's good.
so if you can get Katie Lee's albums and listen to them, I have them all, and they're really very, very. She talks about the dam and how the canyon was ruined and how wonderful it was until it was filled with water. So that's worth listening to.
She's got I don't know if it's a documentary, Damnation, that was popular, a few years ago. And I'm sure you can watch some of it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Hey, Lyman Forsyth, are you still here? Can you tell us what you've just typed in? This is great. Lyman may have left.
Oh.
Lyman met Dick, and Lyman is a wealth of Glen Canyon history in and of himself too. So it's good to remember.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. Any other questions for Cindy?
Huh.
Well, I'm going to do a quick screen share. At least I think I am. There we are. Let's try this and see what happens. Push the right buttons here. Well, that didn't work. I wonder why that didn't work. That's curious. Let's see.
What are you trying to do?
I am trying to show this photograph here of
Oh,
we're going to talk about next month.
okay.
Yeah. So let's see if I can get this done a little better. One more time here. There. That's getting better. Next month presentation. Who is going to give that presentation next month? Well, that didn't work either. Because that's you, Cindy. Oh, I know why. Yeah, it doesn't like this because it's on hide. Yeah. These machines are so clever.
They only do what we tell them to do.
Exactly. Oh my heavens. Now I have to go through all this stuff there. There it is. Next month, I'm going to give a presentation and I'm going to show a film. It's a 30-minute film called Grand Canyon Uprun, Jet Boats Conquer the Colorado. I'll give a 30-minute talk about this trip, its trials, its tribulations, and when one thinks one can conquer a river, one has to think long and hard about it. So that's happening next month, same time, same place. As Dick Sprang would say, same bat channel. As a tribute to Batman that Dick Sprang was heavily involved with. And with that, Cindy Stafford, thank you so very, very much for giving this presentation tonight. We are very grateful for your time and for doing this. I'd like to thank Susan Collins for her help working this Zoom in the background, and the other Grand Canyon Historical Society boards members that were here tonight. Thank you all so much. And everyone else who attended, thanks so much. You all have a very, very good evening.